On the phone, we have the great Dr. Jim Zogby. I got to know Dr. Z on the Unity Reform Commission, which came about after the 2016 Democratic National Committee presidential primary process. I don't know if there's a more difficult way I could describe that, but that horrific primary that we experienced in 2016, which may not be as horrific as the one that we're about to go into. So Dr. Z, I'm so grateful that you're on our first show. Thanks for joining it. And when did you join the Democratic Party, the DNC?
First, I want to take issue with the great Dr. Zogby. I struggle and get along, but I guess I've just been around for a long time. I got in the DNC. It's actually an interesting story, Nomiki. At the 88 primary, Jackson negotiated some terms with the party, and one of the terms was that he would get to pick 8 at-large members. I was one of them. People came to me from the party, Ron Brown, who I respected a lot, who was going to be chair, and said, we don't think it's a good idea you do this right now because Republicans and in particular the Jewish community are going to come after us because of Jackson, because I'd led the platform fight on Palestinian statehood in 88. And you're going to be a target, and they're going to use it, and people really don't think you should take the slot. So I turned it down, and Jackson got mad at me. Brown promised that he would make it up to me, and I took him at his word. Jackson said it wasn't your call. You should have kept it, but I figured I didn't want to be the target of all these attacks, and we picked a young woman from Texas who was just a great person. Her father was an Orthodox priest. She was as good as could be. And sure enough, there were full-page ads in the New York Times, pro-PLO, member of the DNC. That's the Democratic Party of today. They're still doing the same damn ads now, incidentally.
Hang on a second. There was a full-page ad in the New York Times about a DNC appointment?
Yeah. Well, it was her and Willie Barrow, Reverend Willie Barrow, and Bob Farrell, 2 other Jackson appointees. Bob was a city councilman. Willie was a minister in Chicago. And all 3 of them, like myself, were supporters of the Palestinian plank. And the Republican Party and the Jewish leadership decided to try to make an issue of it. What was interesting was that after the election, and when Ron took over at the party, he called me the first day. He was on the job, and he said, "I want you to be my first meeting I have with anybody to say that this party is going to be open to your community," because we had not ever had a meeting with anybody at the party before then. They had locked us out and told us plain and simple that they didn't want to work with us because if they worked with us, it would, put at risk their relationship with the Jewish community, which I didn't believe. I didn't think the Jewish community was going to play that way, but nevertheless, that was the party said. So in 89, I got my first meeting over at the DNC. We worked together with Ron for a number of years. And as he was leaving his post after the next election, when Clinton was elected, he appointed me to fill a slot that was open. And so I joined the DNC late 1992, early 1993, and have been on ever since. But that's how I got on.
So in terms of the Democratic Party of the 90s, I mean, you joined in 1992. Of course, Bill Clinton was the president. What did the Democratic Party function like back then? I mean, we're going to get into today, which is... Yeah,
it was interesting because it was a personal story, but in 94, I got a call to come to the White House in the Roosevelt Room for a meeting with Alexis Herman. President Clinton wanted to do something, and that was create an ethnic council. And ethnic council meant that all the groups that weren't included in affirmative action, Eastern, Central European, Polish, Irish, Italian, and the Arabs. Mm-hmm. And so it was a way to sort of create the public liaison positioning, right? There was a black desk, a Latino desk, all these desks. There was nothing. If you were Polish and wanted to have access to the White House or the party, there was no vehicle for you to do it. So Clinton created that. And they asked me to be one of the co-conveners. And I'll never forget that meeting because after Alexis said that, a woman in the back of the room got up. Her name was Vicky Mangiardo. She had been the deputy public liaison director under Carter in '76, and she got up literally weeping and said, "I just want you to know that in this same room in 1978, we had a meeting of ethnic leaders with Vice President Mondale. And 3 days after that meeting, I had to call Jim Zogby up and tell him that we'd had him at that meeting, but we couldn't have him back again because Jewish organizations complained that we had this pro-Palestinian guy at the meeting and they didn't want him to come back again." And she started crying. She said, "And look at how far we've come and how this community has struggled to gain acceptance. And now, we're asking him to be the co-convener of the group." So the Clinton administration was great working with the ethnic vote and with Arab Americans. Remember, this was Oslo, and he appointed me to co-chair a group with Mel Levine to run a project to promote economic growth in the West Bank and Gaza. And the DNC, similarly, they had a budget for advertising for ethnic outreach. They had a staff person to do ethnic outreach. And it was very significant. There wasn't a place that Clinton would go that they wouldn't call me and say, "Do you have ethnic leaders to meet him in a clutch at the airport?" And it was an incredible outreach effort. Clinton did politics the hard way. He actually did it face to face, touched people, talked to people, invited people to the White House, etc. Everything changed in 2000. When Clinton was out, the whole DNC shifted, and the idea was they weren't going to do desks or outreach anymore. And I started complaining.
Just to break that down a little bit for our listeners who may not understand, the desks and outreach is a way that the DNC was decentralized, meaning everything wasn't concentrated in DC, but there was outreach to communities, or outreach to
right.
Not just state parties, but like groups.
If the chair was going to a meeting in Toledo, they'd say, "Give me your people." And they would have meetings with the black leadership, had meetings with the labor leadership, had meetings with the ethnic leadership, and they had a rural desk to deal with farmers. Like I said, all that ended, and the party became less of an organizing vehicle and more of a data-driven fundraising vehicle. When we would complain and say, "Look, we used to have a budget for putting an ad in the Armenian newspaper and the Greek newspaper, like, I'm a Greek, and here's why I'm a Democrat," they'd actually help us get voter lists together so we could do phone banking. That all stopped.
Wow.
And when we'd say, we need 50,000 just to put something they said, "We don't have the money." And I'd say that's nonsense. You've got millions of dollars. Where is it? That's when I first became aware of the problem between the transparency of the budget and the program of the party. If they had a lot of money, they weren't putting it into organizing. They had a very different vision or concept of how they'd work.
What year would you say that was around? Like,
I'd say it was in the early 2000s. In the early 2000s, that's when Chair McAuliffe was chair, there was a lot of focus on fundraising. The party became kind of a super PAC, and operated that way. It was a fundraising vehicle. It took in money and it went out to consultants to do different kinds of jobs, but was there and to build the database to do more fundraising, right? It actually got worse as we went on. And by the time we got to the Obama administration, there was a brief window when Clyde Williams was political director and Ali Chalupa worked under him. And I would go every year and make my pitch. And Clyde and Ali took it seriously, and it was when Tim Kaine was chair. Wow. We had about a 1.5 year window when they really took it seriously. And Tim Kaine went to many states and did ethnic outreach meetings. Ali Chalupa was the staff person we worked with, and it was a good program. But
so on that note,
like I said, that's no longer there.
on that note, it's interesting to me because this was Bill Clinton. I mean, Bill Clinton, we think about the new Democratic Party that exists today. I think many folks would probably jump to the conclusion that the big money Democratic Party really began under the Clinton administration. But you're saying that it happened, the professional class Democratic Party happened much later. And of course, as
I don't know. I mean, my experience was that in terms of the kind of outreach that in the narrow corner of the party in which I operated, right. That all changed as we got into 2000.
Well, it makes sense because...
And Howard Dean, for all the great stuff Howard Dean did in terms of the 50-state strategy, he did not want to talk about outreach in the way that I did outreach, which is targeting communities. Right. And let me just say, while I'm on the ethnic thing, I think that, because I'm writing an article about it right now, I was at a meeting at the DNC in 2014 after the election. The party pollster comes out and he puts all these slides. Yep. And he goes, "Why is everybody so glum?" He said, "We kept the coalition together." And he had all these slides to show we won the black vote, we won the youth vote, we won the Latino vote, we won the educated women vote. We won all these groups that formed what he called the Obama coalition. But he said, we didn't win enough of them. And so the goal is we got to spend more money on getting that vote out so that if we increase the black vote by 4% and increase this vote by whatever, we can secure victory. So I raised my hand and I said, listen, Cornell, we got blown out in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin, states we never should have lost. Right. And we lost them because my crowd, the ethnic voters, the Eastern Central European, Irish, Italian, working class voters, they have been abandoned by us. Mm-hmm. And we don't have a message for them. We have an either or. You listed this Obama coalition. None of them are that crowd. Why don't we do outreach to them? His response, I'll never forget, he said, "We're not throwing money away, wasting it on people who are never going to vote for us." I shot back. I said, if that's our philosophy, number one, we will never form a majoritarian movement that will be able to govern. Number two, we are being as divisive as Republicans. Right. And number three, you are condemning a whole class of people to having their worker rights, all of the things that they won that started being rolled back under Walker and Snyder and all of the other Republican governors and state legislatures. You are responsible for that because we never should have lost those states. I believe we handed the Trump voters to Trump on a silver platter because we had contempt for them.
Well, and if you think about the history of labor, I just saw this really great documentary on I'm Greek, as you know too well. I just saw this great documentary on labor rights in the longshoremen in the Greek community was extremely involved in the Northwest, Pacific Northwest. I mean, that was the early 1900s and beyond were the ethnics. They were, at that time, they were the ones organizing labor. And of course, their children, many stayed involved, stayed union members. And, we hear it over and over. My community in Astoria is a Trump community, but it also, in the primary, was overwhelmingly Bernie. And so there's something in that trend, that message that crosses over, of course.
And look at the polling data. Bernie does well with that crowd. Bernie and Biden actually both split that crowd. And what the party needs to recognize is that if it just wants to win an election, they can come up with a 50 votes plus one, 50% plus one strategy that corners that Obama vote and gets it out big. They can do that. But that's not going to help them govern. It's going to bring back the Tea Party in full force. What we've got to do is sort of steal back from Trump, those voters who don't belong to him anyway, that he won because he understood their anger, their frustration, and their sense of having been looked down upon by the elites. And here's the other point is that we have blamed them, white voters, for this whole situation. We've called them racist. And frankly, there are some who are racist. There's no question about it. There's a Bubba element in the party, the Republican Party, and in the Deep South and in parts of the North and Northeast that have a racist problem. But many of the voters I know in towns in Pennsylvania in factory towns that closed in Ohio, in mining towns that closed in West Virginia. To call them racist is to totally ignore the reality that their lives have been uprooted and destroyed by an economic system that paid no attention to them, by a political system that ignored them and slighted them, and by us, Democrats, who should have had their back and didn't, because we were so focused on other stuff that we stopped paying attention to the working class who built this party from the beginning of the labor movement on. That's why I'm a Bernie person like you are. Bernie speaks their language. People say Bernie's angry. Sure, he's angry. Yeah. He's angry because he understands the anger of an entire class of Americans who've been ignored. And he has the capability of taking that Obama coalition and keeping it, but also stretching it out to include folks who voted for Trump and never should have voted for Trump, because he gets both. For him, politics is not either or, it's both and. The problem with the party is that I don't think in the culture of the party right now is that I haven't seen that. If you get even down to the 22-year-olds who come in, they start thinking, black vote, Latino vote, gay vote, Jewish vote, this. And I say, what about the Polish vote?
Right.
And they're like, what? What are you talking about? And it's like, you can't win some of these states unless you get the Polish, Hungarian.
Absolutely. I grew up in Buffalo, New York. You don't have the Polish vote, you're in trouble.
It makes no sense to me that they just don't get it.
So on that note,
just good politics.
It's good politics, and I think that's actually, what you touched on with the Clintons is, as much as Bill Clinton was focused on fundraising, he also understood human-to-human contact and traditional politics that somehow got lost along the way.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So as we go into 2020, we were both on the Unity Reform Commission. There were some changes that were made, and then there were some that we fought over a lot that were watered down, and of course, some that just disappeared into the ether. There are a lot of people out there who are wondering what kind of tricks might pop up in the primary process at the convention. What are some scenarios? And there are not a lot of folks who can really talk about that from a point of knowledge, other than maybe some pundits who look to the past. But you've been at conventions that were heated. Jesse Jackson, of course, and of course, 2016, you were very much involved there. And you're part of this process, but what do you think is likely to happen as we go into the primary?
Well, I don't know, but here's what my fear is when we did the superdelegate thing.
Yeah. Which is let's just clarify that we ended.
It is that we said superdelegates can't vote on the first ballot.
Right.
That was smart. It was smart that superdelegates not get to publicly declare their vote before any votes are cast. Or actually, at this point, before the convention even, or at the convention, they can't vote on the first ballot, because what's been happening in the past is that you end up with Hillary Clinton being the decisive winner even before a single vote was cast in Iowa in the first caucus, because AP had called all the superdelegates and said, "Oh, she's almost got 400 votes already."
Before California can vote.
that simply cannot happen. It shouldn't happen. But what my fear is that we get to a convention and it's a brokered convention, and I think it will be. I don't think anyone's going to emerge with 51%. And then on the second ballot, the superdelegates vote. And I think that the party elites, I think they're afraid of Bernie.
Yeah.
I think that they are. It's partly they're afraid of Bernie, and it's partly because they're afraid of the culture of politics that Bernie represents. The working class guy with an accent from Brooklyn, who talks about the billionaire class, which is where they get a lot of the money from to run some of these things like conventions, et cetera, and to fund the super PACs that have become so critical for many of the candidates, and will fund the convention because it will take money from unlimited sources all over the place. They just can't relate to him at all, and they're going to want somebody more comfortable with their culture who won't rock the boat. And I don't know where that ends us up. I think that we're going to have, if we don't watch out, we'll have a very divisive convention and an election that we never should lose because everything is moving our way. I think we can actually throw it away if we're not careful. Jesse Jackson used to say you need both wings to fly. And Bernie's been very good at being clear that he would not, and he didn't want any of his supporters to personally attack any of the other candidates.
That's right.
But wow, they have not returned it in kind. Right. And the media has been absolutely abominable. I mean, they have found every way they could to either slight him, ignore him, or be derisive toward him. And I think, I think part of it is that they can deal with the Harvard-educated, intellectual. They can deal with the young gay guy. They can deal with the old VP. But the working class, Jewish guy with an accent from Brooklyn is kind of like they can't see him. He is as smart, if not smarter, than anybody else in the field. That's not their definition of smart, right?
Right.
And so I think that it's going to be rough sledding. My advice would be smart. You cannot win without him, and I think one of the only ways Democrats not only can win but can win and govern.
Right.
Is with a Bernie Sanders in the White House. And that's the key is right now is not winning because, like I said, I mean, this election with all the constants in play, a rock or a ham sandwich ought to be able to win it.
Hope.
But if we're not smart, we'll end up with something less than a ham sandwich or a rock, and we'll end up losing it. And that's what we did in 2016. And I'm afraid we may make the same mistake again.
Real quick before we go, I just want to, there's been a lot of talk about the membership structure of the DNC. And every 6 months or so, usually around a DNC meeting, there's some sort of story about how, some bad members of the DNC did XYZ, or these people were kicked off. You were famously kicked off of the executive committee when Tom Perez took office, as well as a few other, critics of the money flow of the Democratic Party. But I found this piece in the Sunlight Foundation from 2016, so it's a little bit dated, but I think the numbers still apply for the most part in terms of the membership of the DNC. And the people who are going to be super delegates are going to have a vote on that second ballot. We have to keep in mind that you and I tried very hard to kick out the lobbyists, to kick out the people who had conflicts of interests, and they fought very, very hard to keep those positions in the Democratic Party. And I think part of it is because they make up about a quarter of the vote. And those are, in my opinion, I think those are unmovable votes. The registered and state federal lobbyists, the people who are shadow lobbyists, the people who have business with, their consultants, right? The consultant class. Those are people whose interests, the financial interests, are connected to the Democratic Party, the presidential candidates around the country, and in some cases, the Republican Party as well. And then you have the rest of the party, which is a mix of former members of Congress, current, state and party, local elected officials, party officials, donors, union members, activists, organizers. It's a whole mix. So if we get to this point where there's a second ballot, I mean, it's pretty clear that about a quarter of these voters are not going to be going with Bernie. But there's still like 3/4 there. I mean, if it's Warren and Bernie, and God forbid, like a Pete Buttigieg or a Joe Biden, I mean, it still gets very tight with those numbers. I mean, where are those lobbyists going to go? How do you see that makeup looking?
Well, let me talk. Look, there are a lot of really good people in the DNC. A lot of people who got elected as state committee people, people who have been, there are some state chairs. There are some members of Congress who have been just stalwarts in fighting for all the progressive changes that we've wanted to see happen. And then there are the sort of the as you say, the lobbyists.
And they're not, and just to make it clear for our audience, they're not elected. They're appointed.
No, they're appointed, and they're making money from the party, and they're making decisions about the money. And I find it complicating. When we were on the Unity Reform Commission, what we wanted to do is a transparent budget process. We wanted an accountability process. We wanted to fulfill the bylaws that said, quite simply, that every year we are to evaluate the budget and the effectiveness of the expenditures and staff. We have never done that. In the 26 years I've been in the DNC, we've never done that. No organization could survive and be effective if it doesn't have some degree of accountability, transparency, and democratic decision-making. And yet that's where we are. We elect a chair, and the chair has the chair appoints the executive committee. The chair appoints the 3 standing committees. 2/3 of the members of all those committees are also the at-large delegates that the chair appoints. What are we doing here?
Yeah,
we would never accept to have foreign relations with a country that operated that way, that had no transparency, no accountability, and no democratic decision-making. And it can be a good chair. I mean, there have been some great chairs since I've been in the DNC. There have been some good people, but no accountability or transparency. And members have, for the longest time, been props at meetings. You know, they want 400 people to sit in an audience and clap for speeches. I'll tell you, one of the things that's happened since the Bernie campaign in 2016 is that for the first time in the 26 years I was on the DNC, we actually had an election for chair and an election for every office other than, we've never had elections before then. We would simply come to a meeting and find out who the new chair was, and then we'd be asked to, they'd say it was an election. We'd say, all those in favor, aye. The ayes went. That's how elections used to happen. It was one candidate, one vote. It was like the old, the Mubarak elections in Egypt, right? 99% voted for the president. And that's how, it was all a voice vote. Since Bernie, we not only have had elections, but we've actually had floor fights on issues. We've never had those before. I can't ever remember an issue being voted on the floor and being contested in that way.
Yeah.
And so that's exciting, and I think that the more people we elect to positions in party posts across the country, the numbers are growing. We're up to 70 now. We're in a position where we can make a fight, and the fight has to be won, not for the sake of fighting, but for the sake of making the party a viable, transparent, accountable, democratic organization, because that will be its ultimate strength.
That's it. I mean, when we...
And I thank you.
Go ahead.
I thank you for the opportunity to talk about it.
Well,
one of my favorite topics.
Dr. Z, this is one of my favorite topics, and I we could be doing it over dinner, or we could do it on a show. So,
yeah, let me tell you, after the last meeting, though, the DNC has now taken a look at ethnic voters, and I'm hopeful that we're going to have a meeting in a short while, and I'm hopeful that they'll actually come up with a program, because it simply has to be. There are things that have to be done. That's one of them. Is outreach to voters that we have slighted and ignored for a way too long a period of time. Absolutely. I think they'll make a difference in this election, but people have to be willing to go for them. So we'll see. I hope that they make the right decision and do what we're asking them to do. But we'll see. The transparency issue, that'll have to be another time. I think we're just in the beginning of that one, but I hope that we'll get someplace on that one too.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Nomiki.
Thank you for your lifetime of work on this, and hopefully we can have another conversation about this pretty soon after the next DNC meeting, so you can give us a recap.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks,
Bye. Dr. Z.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
On that topic, there's just so much to discuss with the Democratic Party. It's highly underreported, and most reporters come around every 6 months after something dramatic has happened at the DNC meetings, and they don't understand the structure of the DNC, they don't understand the history of the DNC, and I'm grateful that there are people like Dr. Z who've been there for several decades, so he is able to offer perspective that many Democrats don't have or don't have the courage to offer. I mean, through my time working with him, it was surprising to see how many people would come forward and meet with us, and they knew what was going on with the finances. They knew what was happening with the unfair appointments. They knew what was happening with the concentration of power in the chair's hands. And they would talk behind the scenes, but they would never want to rattle anything. They didn't want to have the potential of losing their seat. And in 2016, when Bernie ran, I think it empowered a lot of people in the DNC to finally come out. Of course, when Keith Ellison ran against against Chairman Perez, there was a real debate over issues that had never been brought up. Ray Buckley, who's the chair of the New Hampshire Democratic Party, was the first person to say, I'm on the executive committee and I've never seen a budget. Like, Morgan Stanley doesn't operate that way. At the Democratic Party, lets the budget get decided by a chair who's not always, or really hasn't been elected. They take all that money that you're donating, and then they decide to put it into a few hands. And I think what we're going to see in this election, and this is my major concern, is there is this quarter of the Democratic Party that is appointed by the chair. There is this quarter that is made up of lobbyists and contractors. I mean, just to give you an example, I was on a committee with somebody who was an actual weapons trader. I mean, that's what one of his clients that's what he represented in his firm. That and many other interesting interests. And some of them also work with presidential candidates. Zed Jelani was very good at reporting on this at The Intercept. And Lee Fang, of course, has done a lot of work on following the money at the DNC, but far more of that needs to happen. There are too many lobbyists, too many contractors at the DNC who are going to have a deciding vote, potentially, on the second ballot. So it's not just the superdelegates. There are a lot of decent people who were elected in the Democratic Party that are going to be those second ballot superdelegates. It is that chunk of superdelegates who had no place in being in the DNC. They weren't elected. They're not from many of them don't even live in the areas where they were elected. In the case of New York, many of them live in D.C. They're political appointees put on oversight committees that decide where the resources of the Democratic Party are going, which consultants are used, and that is never held accountable, which is against the DNC rules. And whether or not they should be investing in states across the country. Because when you invest in parties, like Dr. Z was saying from years ago when the Clintons would invest in the Polish community. I mean, it's almost comical now because they don't even put money into a major state's party. And then they talk about flipping Texas, flipping Arizona, flipping all these states. Well, where's the money? It only seems to come around when there's a big election where there's money to be made with consultants that come from DC. So ultimately, to have a vibrant party, there has to be full transparency, full democracy. And what that means for the Democratic election is when you have members that are not elected and have, frankly, conflicts of interests, those are the people who are determining who our Democratic presidential nominee could be and how that fares against Trump. So when people say to me, give up on the Democratic Party, I narrow it down to 72 people in the Democratic Party out of almost 450 people that could be determining who our next president is. 70 people who represent weapons dealers, oil companies, who represent insurance companies, who represent pharmaceutical companies. I mean, there's a long list of foreign governments, Saudi Arabia, who represent Israel, who represent Russian interests, which is hysterical. I mean, you look at the list of these people that were not elected, and they could ultimately be determining who is going to be the presidential nominee. I don't like to focus too much on presidential politics until it really matters, but I think as we gear up into the next DNC meeting, just as the Sunrise Movement exposed the bullshit coming out of the Democratic Party when it came to the climate debate, we need to start calling out who these people are and really holding the chairman accountable, because the Democratic Party should be democratically representing its members and the constituents across the country that are going to be voting for their nominee. There needs to be a fair process. It goes much deeper than what we saw in 2016. It goes with the functioning and the structure of the party. And so thank you to Dr. Zogby. It was so great to serve with him on the committee, and we'll be giving you updates regularly on what's happening throughout the primary process, how debates were structured and picked, who the partners are at the debates. I mean, there's an upcoming debate that just moved from Los Angeles, and it's a partnership between PBS NewsHour and Politico. Well, Politico was founded by Republicans. So let's just think about that for a second, that a Democratic debate is being co-sponsored by a media company that does not have fact checking. I actually know this personally, but also is founded by Republicans. So there is much more to the story of the presidential election. And I'm just so grateful that there are people interested in this, and that the floodgates have opened up, that the Bernie Sanders movement opened up this conversation, but also the media world has shifted so much now there are people out there who are able, capable, and have access to having conversations about these issues.